Hello, hello. Welcome to your new position at the Socially Distant Untitled Podcast. I actually had your job before you, and I hated myself to the point where I couldn't get out of bed in the morning. You know, quarantine, coronation, brother needs a hug. Hello, everybody. My name is Christos Kydonieus, and welcome to the newest episode of the Socially Distant Untitled Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about everyone's favorite pastime that they secretly hate themselves for doing, video games. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, as usual, Dominik Zeman. And today, as we're talking about video games, we have ourselves a very special guest. Our guest spearheaded her own video game company in 2008, where she was bought out by Nintendo in 2013 and served as Reggie Fils-Aimé's right-handed consultant on how to make good games. Really worked at Nintendo. Some of her premier games are The Last of Us Part 2, the critically acclaimed Five Nights at Freddy's video game series. Yeah, you know what? What am I doing taking away from your legacy? Please introduce yourself.
Exactly. Hello, everyone.
Well, thank
I'm
you
Violet.
for your input.
Yeah.
Would you like to introduce yourself? Maybe talk about your up-and-coming fame in the esports community?
Yeah, so my name's Violet. I play some fighting games right now. I've mostly been into Rivals of Aether, so I'm a Shovel Knight and Sylvanas player. I run some amateur-level tournaments along with a few other people. And yeah, it's about the gist of that. And I'm looking to study game design next year at Columbia College Chicago. Should be a fun time.
Wow.
100%.
That's actually really good. Not gonna lie, I was not expecting such a formal and well thought out and just eloquent response for this level of podcast, but we thank you for this. So as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be talking about movies with video games. Wait. Movies featuring video games.
Movie video games in them.
No, but that's a lot more movies, right? Like, there are games where... Ferris Bueller, they play, like, Space Invaders, but that movie isn't a video game movie. You small-brained... Small brain?
You know what, Chris?
SMH my head.
What if you are the small brain? One time...
I'll have you know that I personally, with some sandpaper, I just smooth out the ridges on my brain. And because of that, there's less friction with how fast... It just allows it to run faster, you know? It doesn't rub up against each other. So I have the smoothest, most slickest brain.
The smooth brain picture. It gets me.
Smooth brain.
Round your brain down.
It's really just a circle.
Slippery.
So, yes, getting back onto the track. We will be talking about video game movies. And as usual, we're going to be split up in our two different segments. One where we come with some suggestions of some movies to watch. You know, you're just sitting around playing video games. Maybe you want to watch it and not have some stupid commentator commentating on it. So you want to watch a video game movie. We will talk about our reactions towards it, if they're good or not. We'll avoid spoilers. And then we'll end with telling you where you can watch them for yourselves, if we can remember. Then we'll get into our, as typical, prompt section, where we have a prompt written for us by world-class moviegoers and writers, critical thinkers, philosophers of the next generation, really. And we will discuss it, as we are really just the rebirth of the School of Athens.
We are the neo-renaissance, dare I say.
Yeah.
That was not funny. Take that back.
Let's here's what we'll do. We'll cut out every joke in this podcast that's bad, and we're just gonna be left with Violet's introduction.
I know, right? The only professional part about any video on our YouTube channel so far has been Violet's introduction.
Right. Okay, Violet, as our very special guest, what movie did you watch? And tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so I watched the first Persona 3 movie, Rebirth. So for those who aren't familiar, the Persona series is one. It's essentially a mix of, or at least of the modern games. It's basically a mix of a life sim game and a JRPG. So most of the Persona games have also gotten like anime adaptations, and for Persona 3, they made 4 movies for it, one for each of the seasons, because the game basically takes a full year. So the basic premise of Persona 3 is that there's this young boy, a high schooler, named Makoto Yuki, and he is transferred to a new school because his parents are both dead. Oops.
Big rips.
Yeah, so he gets transferred to a new school, and as it turns out, there is a 25th hour to the day called the Dark Hour. That's basically like happens at midnight. And only certain people are able to actually function during the Dark Hour. To not get too deep into the premise, essentially some people are able to summon what are called personas during the Dark Hour and fight off monsters called shadows. The whole story of Persona 3 is essentially about figuring out why the Dark Hour exists and how they can stop it. And also, on a more general sense, it's about facing death as a concept. This isn't something that's really touched on a ton in the first movie, but it would be in the later ones, since this movie is essentially an adaptation of Persona 3's story.
Right.
So, some of the things I really noticed, right, is that you're taking a 60-hour game and compressing it into 6 hours of film, essentially. So because of that, a lot of things have to be, especially from like a gameplay sense, really just simplified and sort of rushed past.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some things, for example, in the Persona games, the main character could summon multiple personas, whereas the party members can only summon one. And you're able to basically use personas to make new ones in the place called the Velvet Room. Now, in the game, a lot of the time you would be transferred here during, usually in between days. So like when the main character would go to sleep, you'd suddenly be in the Velvet Room and you'd get a little monologue. In the movie, they kind of just cut to it very randomly. And they're just like, here's some information about how personas work.
Now, would you say that like takes away from the movie? I shouldn't say movie, from the story overall.
That was the one thing that really, and I don't know how they sort of play off of it in the later ones, of course, but that was something that I thought was really weird, is that the role of the Velvet Room in general isn't really able to be touched on in the same way it is in the games, because they just have so much story to get through.
Yeah, I get that. I feel like one movie that has like a similar sort of like, I don't want to say like problem, but is American Psycho. Admittedly, as I've said previously on the podcast, I think the movie's great, but in condensing the movie from a book to a movie, you ended up cutting out a lot of the story, right? Like a lot more of Patrick Bateman's fall. I shouldn't even say fall, more like descent into madness. Is a lot more slowed and played out, which really like heightens the impact, and especially takes away from a lot more of the goofier parts of the movie. Right, like when you watch American Psycho, especially for the first time, you think the movie is very goofy with like, out of nowhere, he'll be chasing people around with a chainsaw and just dropping it. Or the final sequence of the movie where it's like, insert cat into ATM, blow up a car with one bullet to the gas tank. Right, like, those moments feel a lot more goofy and cartoony and kind of take away from the movie. But then if you were to experience it with the book, or in Persona's case, the games, you get a lot more added from the adaptation. Yeah.
One thing that I actually think is kind of interesting is that, especially Persona 3, if you're talking about like the original versions, is that, quite frankly, the weakest part of Persona 3 is probably its gameplay.
Right.
It's really hard carried by its story, and like, it's mostly like, it's weird because the day sections a lot of people really enjoy, and the night sections get really repetitive because, again, it's a 60-hour game.
Right.
And there's a lot of sameness after a certain point in sort of what you're doing at night. With the movie, a lot of that stuff is cut out, so you get to really focus on just the story aspects, which are legitimately a lot of the best parts of Persona 3.
So would you say that does... So, like, a lot of the times, like, when you have those, like, more repetitive moments, I've noticed in, like, video games, where it's, like, when you have those moments, it allows you to appreciate the story and really, like, sink it in. So, like, recently I did a review on BioShock. As part of our new show, the PP review, the post-podcast review, which I recommend checking out, Something I didn't get a chance to talk about is there are certain parts of the game which feel repetitive at some points, where you're just traveling from building to building outside in an underwater tunnel. And now these moments don't really have enemies, they're kind of slow, and you don't really do anything. But what it does is that it gives you a moment to catch up on any missed story logs you didn't get a chance to listen to. And it gives you a chance to reflect on the gameplay thus far, giving you like a sense of, okay, let's just take a little break. Do you think that repetitive gameplay from the game adds anything in that sense to the story, where it's like it allows you to think about it and really like feel its impact, or is it just too repetitive that transferring it to movie was just a better move overall?
I think in Persona 3's case, the actual like battle part of the game, not so much.
Right.
And that's mostly because it doesn't actually change very much throughout the entire game, right? Like, it's essentially one giant dungeon that you have to traverse, and you like keep going back to time and time again. Now, in terms of the day sections, Persona has what's called social links,
Right.
which are basically where basically just becoming friends with people.
It's high school, right?
Yeah, no, it's basically just high school dating sims. There's a whole overarching theme of the power of friendship and stuff that's a little weird, but I swear it makes sense in context.
Okay.
But they legitimately turn the power of friendship into a gameplay mechanic.
It's funny because I personally always have hated all of my friends, almost, if not more than I hate myself. So, like, I've never been really able to, like...
Really, I haven't been able
that.
to... Really not vibe with
And
that?
now, it's a gameplay mechanic. The power of friendship.
The triangle...
But the main thing that gets lost, right, is when a lot of the social links, they're not... Doing social links isn't necessarily optional, because it's how you get stronger.
Right.
But what social links you do, you get to choose. A lot of the social links get glossed over in the movie because
so you just
it's
feel
all
like
up to what
less
you do.
connected? Because you're not making... So, like, you feel less connected to the story because you're not the one making the choices.
It's not so much that you feel less connected to the story, but I guess more so you feel less connected to the world.
Okay.
Now, so far, what I've noticed is that they actually do a slightly better job of, I guess, building on the characters, right? Because a lot of the time, even with your party members, their character development gets pretty hard carried by social links.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much in Persona 3's case, but in the later games, it definitely happens. But even then, there's still a decent amount of focus put on the party members and what happens to them.
Right.
And like why they ended up in their current position, which I think is pretty good. And I also think, I think the best part about switching Persona from movie to game is that the main characters in Persona games are almost always essentially blank slates. The movie actually expounds on this a little bit more, and most of what people say about the main character, which is that his character arc is essentially not caring about anything to actually finding reasons to care about life, you actually see it happen in the movie. In the games, you don't really see it happen very much because it's through the social links. And I think the movie does a much better job of tying that into the main story.
And does this... So, like, what I found interesting that you brought up originally with your review of this adaptation is the concept of death. I'm guessing that inevitably plays into, like, the main character's existentialism about whether or not life is worth living plays into this theme of death that you brought up earlier.
A little bit, yeah. It's really hard to not go into details, especially because, again, this theme really doesn't come into play until, like, the second half of the game story. And that would be the same with the movies, where I don't think it would really start coming out until, like, part 3.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it's actually more so how the party members face death instead of the main character, because, again, in-game, you don't actually get to see or hear much of what the main character says or thinks.
Right.
In the movie, you think a little bit. You get to see a little bit more of that. Like, even in just the first part, you kind of see some character development, which I thought was pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I kind of forgot to bring up an image of the poster.
Nice.
Nice.
Oh, what I found interesting is that you guys, Christos, you brought up American Psycho, which was a book, and this is obviously a movie based on a video game.
Mm-hmm.
I find it really interesting how, having these longer formats of like media, such as a book or a video game, compared to a movie, where you can interact with it, it really changes the user experience, right? Like, when you read a book, you imagine what the characters are like. No, not what they are like, but what they look like,
Right.
How they, what do you call it, like mannerisms and stuff like that. You get to imagine that, and in the book, you get to play, or in the game, you get to play that out. And so I guess it's interesting that you brought up whether it felt less connected, because I think like the inherent format of a movie is just sitting and watching something someone else made, so it should feel less connected. It's something like you in a video game, you play it, you feel like you are, somewhat, you feel like you are the character, and in a book, you can make the character be like what you want them to be like. I think the bringing up the idea between being connected to a movie is super interesting.
So Dominik, you brought up like two very interesting things with that. The first one that I'm going to add on is something we have talked extensively about in almost every single episode of this podcast, because I think it's one of the most important parts of a film and really any sort of media, is that the more disconnected you are from something, the more easier it is to discuss truth. So as you're talking about like connectivity, right? With a video game, you're ultimately the most connected, right? You're going to be the most real because you visibly see it and you're making the decisions, right? In a movie, you can't really make the decisions as much you would in a game. In a movie, you view it happen, but you're still connected visually, audibly, and whatever other senses go on to it. Ultimately, you're more connected than you are with a book. This is why it's a lot easier for a book to convey truth. When you look at like philosophy books versus philosophical movies, it's a lot more easy to direct ideas and themes in a book than a movie. Which brings up like what you're talking about of the importance of adaptations and what certain adaptations can bring. Like Violet said, the adaptation of this video game allowed for a disconnect of you to the main character, which allowed for more exploration of the main character, which ultimately added to the overall flow of the movie and that character's particular character development. And another thing that you reminded me of when saying that, Dominik, was how movie adaptations are viewed compared to book adaptations for movies. I don't want to sound like a Reddit incel in saying this, but I'd say the majority of society just will kind of judge a video game as something incapable of telling a coherent story, or being able to tell a story at all, which is, I would say it's just flawed. Because if we go back to what I was saying about connectivity, yes, you might be able to glean less truth from it in the short run, but ultimately the gameplay makes you feel the world more, and can do even a better job of conveying emotions, because, you get to choose the decisions around these characters and ultimately control their lives.
I think why you sound like a Reddit incel when you said, or when people say Reddit incel, why you might be considered that is because books have this, like, we're better, like, the British are to the Americans, we're better than you, So books are like that with media formats, It's like seen as a more sophisticated way of telling a story. They take games like Firewatch and stuff like that, where it's really story-driven and really makes you feel the emotions. I went through Firewatch, and I compare that to reading a great book. It's,
video games allow you to convey audio, the same audio and visual splendor of a movie, albeit video games tend to have very different budget layouts, because you also need to make sure the game is programmed correctly and whatnot. Video games can be a lot more costly than a movie, but the movie can spend majority of its budget on visual, whatever. Video games can ultimately offer the same experience as a movie, but expand on it in that you can play with it, and where it becomes more and more of your experience rather than you experiencing the lives of other people. How would you comment on this?
Actually, just another example of a game that I think tackles the theme in a pretty similar. It has a similar theme and does the theme in a very similar way, but I think it'll be easier for me to explain because there's a lot less story here, so I won't really be spoiling anything by telling you about this, by going into it. And that's Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, right?
Right.
That's another story that has a big emphasis on the theme of death, and essentially, right, it's an apocalypse story.
Right. So
for those of you who haven't played it, the premise is that the moon's going to fall in 3 days, and you need to call upon 4 giants to stop the moon from crashing into the world. You have this artifact that can send you back in time the start of those 3 days, so you can repeat that cycle infinitely until you are done with it. But it's important to note that, of course, every single time you let those days progress, right? People don't realize this, and the game is essentially centered around this town called Clocktown, and the residents of Clocktown, you can see them react to and sort of change their behavior as the moon gets closer. And probably one of the greatest atmospheres created in any video game is the last 6 hours in Clocktown, before the moon falls, where you have various residents who are legitimately like cowering in fear. The music is some of the most somber in the entire Zelda series. The world's very dark, right? Most people aren't around anymore, and it's just and there's constant tremors on the ground too, and you can feel all of this happening.
Right.
It's because you're the one controlling the character and you're the one exploring the world. It feels a lot more personal, and I think that's the biggest strength of story racing games. Right. You also have games like Undertale, where you have personal choice in the story, and it'll also break the fourth wall to legitimately tell you, like, look at the things you did, or like, look at how terrible of a person you are if you do like the genocide routes. Right. It adds another extra layer, a fourth layer, so to speak, into being kind of feeling connected to a story.
Right. And even just to expand on that, when you look at Majora's Mask, not only is it like a incredible story of like an incredible apocalyptic story, the game's themes are insane, right? Like, as you explore the game, I'm not going to spoil it, but like, how do I explain this? There's a lot of characters that reflect like the 5 stages of grief or whatever, but really you can see with the main character how. So to say that the Majora's Mask is a sequel to a game called Ocarina of Time, where this hero saves a kingdom, but ultimately is not recognized for his accomplishments. So a lot of people see Majora's Mask as a game where Link, the main character, is trying to cope with not being regaled as the hero he really was. And it really brings home themes of, like, that Violet brought up in the game's atmosphere: despair, death, and acceptance. Ultimately, those 3 days will pass, whether you want them to or not, and eventually Link will save the day. But again, no one's going to know how he did it. But this time he's able to accept his fate and move forward.
Acceptance.
Soon we do need to move on to some of our other movies, but I have a couple more. I have a couple more questions to you about this movie.
Okay.
First off, what would you say is the audience of Persona 3, the movie? Like, what audience is it directed towards? Is it directed towards gamers, people who've played the game, or would you see possibly people who don't play games at all, or very new to the Persona franchise, enjoying this movie?
I definitely think there's a lot of, I guess, a bit of both. I think the main strength is, like, if you're familiar with some of the aspects of Persona 3 that you don't think you would enjoy, or you just don't have the time or patience to put into a 60-hour RPG, then the movie is a pretty solid alternative from what I've seen so far, right, where it hits on a lot of the story beats. Some stuff is obviously, consolidated and, like, scrunched together a little bit, but you still get the general gist of what's going on in the game.
Right.
And it still presents everything in a way that I think is pretty respectful to the original.
But I mean, like, could someone who's never seen doesn't even know what Persona is and doesn't really play games other than, like, Candy Crush and other mind benders on the phone, watch this movie and enjoy it?
I think as long as you have some kind of, as long as you're able to appreciate, like, look past some of the more, I guess, Japanese elements of the game, because I know not everyone consumes the same amount of Japanese media I do, so some of the stuff that might seem normal to me might not seem as normal to other people.
Right.
I'm not saying, because I wouldn't even be able to notice what they are at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you can put that aside, it's pretty friendly to newcomers, except for explaining
what's the stanza
room-related stuff.
Okay.
And, like, essentially, that's the main thing I've noticed, is that it doesn't really... you don't really have to know how the main character's personas work in order for it to make sense. Or, like, in order for you to enjoy it, I guess. But they gloss over it so heavily that it often feels like you're just kind of doing stuff randomly. Because, right, the whole thing is that you can choose which personas you have and you can get more over time.
Right.
He'll just kind of come into a fight and suddenly have a new persona that you've never seen before. And you just kind of have to accept that that's how it's going to work in this version of the story.
Mm-hmm.
That's the main thing that I think is really lacking, is that I think just putting a little bit more time into this scenes and explaining it a little bit better would have helped a tiny bit. But other than that, I do think it's a pretty easy to enjoy adaptation.
I guess it's like picking out a Marvel movie and like not knowing, and like not having seen any other ones, and like
It's kind of different though. Like I know people who've seen like Guardians of the Galaxy or Ant-Man or a lot of the different ones and just like been able to watch it.
But say you haven't seen any movie but Ant-Man.
And then you go to watch Endgame.
Not even Civil War. Captain America Civil War.
Okay. If you've seen any of the Avengers movies without watching the rest.
Yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That was a lot. That was actually a really good discussion. I'm kind of proud of ourselves for that one. Pat on the back. Now, the next review will be done by Dominik Zeman. Dominik, what movie are you talking about?
Well,
good to know. I will be talking about... I will be discussing, once again, for the 5th time, the video game of Ace Ventura 3, Back from the Past.
Wait, are you...
I'm
wait,
kidding, no, Dominic, you're up. What movie are you reviewing?
Okay. So, the movie I will be talking about is Scott Pilgrim.
Oh, wait, hold up. Wait, we almost forgot. See, I even called this out earlier. I would forget. Violet, where can you watch Persona 3?
Offhand, the only place I know of is Amazon. But so yeah.
Available on Amazon Prime. Nice.
Amazon Prime. Beyond that, Jeff Bezos, dap me up. What's up?
What's up, Jeff Bezos? You're about to become the world's first trillionaire off a pandemic. But that's a discussion for that's for a little bit more of a higher class podcast. We're here just trying to talk about video game movies.
That's a different philosophy lesson, and we're not getting it. Alright, so I'll be talking about Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Now, I know this isn't necessarily a video game movie, as there's no, like...
No, I disagree. I'd say Scott Pilgrim versus the World is completely a video game movie, but continue.
Well, yeah, but, okay. So this is, I was just about to say why it is a video game movie, Christos, so...
Well, it might... Wait, sorry, just before I forget. Whereas... the movie Violet brought up, Persona 3, the animated edition, is a movie that is going to skew towards a more, like, Japanese-focused moviegoer's watch list. Scott Pilgrim is completely for any Western American that can just watch it. Right? I could recommend, personally, this movie to anyone, but continue, Dominic. Sorry.
It's Canadian, so...
Literally, I couldn't... Canada doesn't exist. Canada is part of North America, therefore you can say anything Canadian is American. I don't mean United Statesian. Mongrel.
So, why Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a video game movie is because it follows, as a movie, it follows the structure as a video game would, right?
Right.
So, without just spoiling the movie in any major way, the movie is about this dude, Scott Pilgrim, that you see on the cover, falling in love with an edgy e-girl.
As you do.
After he starts dating her, understanding that he has to battle, is it 7 or 9?
7 evil exes.
Yeah, the 7 evil exes. And these fights are like video games with like coins dropping out of the exes when he beats them and stuff like that. It's a really fun movie. Visually, absolutely immaculate. Wonderful movie because it's based off a, what do you call it? A comic book,
graphic
right?
novel, yeah.
So the director and, the guy that made this movie, he was writing the comic books, but he didn't finish it. Like, he made the first, volume before, and he made this movie in between the first and the last volumes. So the first volumes goes a bit off from the movie itself, but then you see the later volumes, they follow the movie exactly. So it's a really interesting concept where before you have, movies based off of comic books and, Akira, where a lot of stuff gets really compressed. Here it's the other way around, where you have a comic book based off a movie, which is pretty interesting fact.
Yeah, there's actually
But,
a really interesting, like, design philosophy between, like, converting it from comic book to this. So, while the guy who wrote the comic books was either an American or either from the United States or from Canada, he directly based it off of Japanese video games. And it included an art style that was more of an American take on the Japanese art style, which is actually, funnily enough, a Japanese take on the Disney art style. But animation history for a later date, long story short, yeah, the story behind the making of this movie is really interesting.
Yeah, I think what Christos mentioned to me earlier, because I didn't really know any like quirky. I just really enjoyed the movie, and I wanted to bring it up, but I didn't know really any quirky facts. Like I usually say something. The movie. So Christos told me the movie was a box office tank.
Yeah,
Didn't
bombed.
do well at a, because who was the creative director of Family Guy, or what was it?
So the guy who made Family Guy and the rest of those shows, Seth MacFarlane, gave this movie, saw it on like the first night, and gave it such an abysmal review, saying it was the worst movie of like he's ever seen. I think like part of the exact tweet was Scott Pilgrim 0, the world won.
That's really funny. That's you have to admire some comedy. But no, it's a really great movie, and
it has an extensive cult following because after this movie came out, funnily enough, there was a video game that came out about it that was actually apparently really good.
Yeah. And what was it? I was going to say it is a great movie because though it's not about teenagers, it feels like a movie about teenagers,
Yeah, it's about young adults, regardless.
That a lot of people, especially in our age bracket, can relate to, presented in a really funny, wacky, cartoony sense. It's like you combine teenage life is listening to alternative music, playing video games, having odd relationships, and before Christos so rudely interrupted me with his terrible Wi-Fi.
Yes, because I control the speed in which bits travel across the ocean and into my computer.
Yeah, you're fat. You're blocking the bits. Liberal destroyed.
You have bad Wi-Fi. I can't control my Wi-Fi. Well, you're fat. Oh.
Got him.
Got him.
Yeah, it's a wonderful movie. I really it's
a great coming of age tale, especially relatable for our generation.
100%. This is the meme. There's a song on Spotify called "Scott Pilgrim versus the World Ruined the Whole Generation of Women." It's just really funny because you take the archetypes of.
I would let Ramona Flowers step on me and spit on me, and I'd probably say thank you.
Yeah, 100%. Honestly, it would probably be the best sensation that I felt in my entire life.
It will be the only sensation I've felt in my life.
It would be the last sensation I felt in my entire life.
And I would still be thankful.
Yeah, just
100%.
What is it The song goes dyed blonde hair but dead inside. What is it? Thinks communism is the way to go. It's just a fun movie. It represents some great liberal values in a very wacky comedic sense.
Yeah.
And it's created a really big pop culture impact.
I mean, what this movie really is a love letter to pop culture, right? Rather than being about video games, what it does is that it takes what really feels like a video game and made it into a movie. Right, it's your basic movie flourished with video game nods, and it really helps you connect with the character, right? For Dominik and I, we can really, really relate to Scott Pilgrim. Both of us after watching that movie was damn, we are Scott Pilgrim. Because he's a kind of nerdy, awkward kid who grew up playing video games and is really struggling to figure out life for himself. He's ultimately flawed, kind of trying to figure out his own place in his society and in the relationships he has with the people around him. And by the end, he's still a little flawed, but he's a lot better for the experience. Dominik and I in particular, and really a lot of people just our age, can really relate to Scott Pilgrim, you know, being a nerdy, kind of awkward teenager growing up who's flawed with he's flawed because he can't really handle the relationships he makes with the people around him. And over the course of the movie, he's really figuring out, okay, I need to do this while doing this. And really, the problem with all my relationships is that I myself am just as flawed as everyone around me, and really need to work on myself as a person. And by the end, sure, Scott Pilgrim is still flawed at not really being able to see smaller pictures, like smaller scenarios, really like the nuances of what people say to him. But ultimately, he is better for the ride and has formed relationships that he can really count on. However, I do have one sort of complaint for this movie. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. The movie uses video games amazingly and like just pop culture as like a device to really move the movie forward, as like a thematic element that really makes you connect more to the character, as I said earlier. However, the movie really loses steam after the first act. I would say that the beginning of this movie is the best beginning of a movie I've ever seen. Like after the first night with Ramona Flowers, from the beginning to then, really, you could say to the Chris Evans bit, it is the best movie I have ever seen. But after that, it's still great, don't get me wrong, but it kind of starts losing some steam and kind of losing like the impact of that thematic, of the pop culture themes behind it.
I think that, and it makes sense because, like I said, the author was writing the comic book as he was.
So they had to rush the ending.
Yeah, he didn't know what he was making while making it, right? Like, there wasn't a format.
Yeah.
Like, when making a book, you probably think about
Look at the end of Game of Thrones. Starbucks coffee cup, mid-shot.
Exactly. Like, that's, just sloppy form. Get on it.
Get on it.
But no, it's a fun watch. This movie I really wanted to watch, and it's not on Netflix in my country. So
it is on American Netflix and on Amazon Prime.
Yeah, and
so
I
that brings us to today's sponsor. NordVPN is a free online.
Jeff Bezos, please sponsor us.
Yeah, Jeff Bezos. We would take an Audible. Blue Apron, Audible. Get on that.
Would you take Raid Shadow Legends?
You already know.
100%.
You can join
You
our
sell your
guild
soul.
for 1 free champion and 700 silver.
Dude,
No way.
I'd sell out so fast if I could say Raid Shadow Legends while being sponsored.
Oh my god! I'd trade my firstborn child for a Raid Shadow Legends.
100%.
Another thing that's actually, going back to the movie, another thing that we should probably bring up is the movie has some really good performances, and the actors do amazing. And it has a really, like, star cast, despite being only on, like, I want to say $40 million budget, right? Like, this is because a lot of, like, the cast members became a lot more famous after this movie. Like, right now, the whole budget of that movie could have been spent paying Chris Evans alone, because the movie came out before he did the Avengers. I'd say the performances were great. The actors became... The cast is pretty star, having Michael Cera, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, Ruth, whatever his name is, the bootleg Superman, and the Atom. Not to say he's a bad actor, he's just, his roles are really weird. And of course Chris Evans, who the entire budget of the show could have been spent to hiring him, because this happened before the Avengers.
Yeah. And before we move on to the next movie, I just wanted to say that if you watch them, I've looked into some of the comic books too, and they explore a lot more of the themes. Like, it talks about feminism, his relationship with his parents, and a lot of these like deeper themes.
Right, because the movie takes place after college, while the books start in high school, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it gets to go a lot deeper with a lot of interesting themes, especially with Ramona and like the other side characters.
Yeah, so something that I just know from the I haven't read any of the comic books, but I've seen some like discussions about it, is that a lot of the side characters, especially as members of the band, get a lot more screen time and a lot more development, especially with their relationships with Scott Pilgrim in the comic books, especially the female one that they quote-unquote did not date.
Yeah.
Now it's time for the next movie. If you couldn't tell from the thumbnail, I'll be talking about Ace Ventura 4, Poo Poo Diaper Pets.
How many times are you gonna make this joke? It wasn't funny the first time. It's not funny now. Get wrecked. Left wing destroyed.
Oh! Okay,
It just doesn't
fine.
have any other jokes.
Wow, I'll be talking about the 2020 hit Sonic the Hedgehog, which is a movie about Sonic the Hedgehog. Okay. This movie does a really good job of completely ignoring all past Sonic lore and stories and making a good, fun movie featuring an fun, interesting cast of characters. Eggman and Sonic are amazing in this movie. They don't really follow whatever story they had in the comic books or in the video games or whatever, but what they do is that they apply them to a movie genre and set these two characters against each other. And the result is, as you would expect, a hardcore 90s fun time adventure just set in the 2020s. Ultimately an amazing movie. Jim Carrey does an amazing performance. Schwartz does a great job as Sonic. But Jim Carrey did save this movie in a lot of ways. And Jim Carrey will outrightly say in several interviews, he says, "I am this movie."
Yeah, he personifies. It's what's it called? The the acting where you pretend to be the character.
Yeah. Oh my god.
Acting.
The movie Man on the Moon and its follow-up, which talks about making that movie, Jim and Andy does a great job of going into Jim Carrey's method acting. So in one movie where he was playing a character, I shouldn't say character, an old comedian who hated the show he was working on so much he brought a lot of prostitutes. While making the movie, he got a whole gang of Hell's Angels to just show up and thrash the set. But that's more or less besides the point. Sonic the Hedgehog, I mean, even in the script for this movie, they had written down Jim Carrey does what Jim Carrey does best. Like, just let Jim Carrey be and let him rule this movie for us, okay? Visually, the movie is good, which is a surprising bit. Violet, as a video game consultant, and knowing truly about the Sonic redesigns, can you talk to us a little bit about the plight this game went through?
Absolutely. So Sonic is, of course, a game that was made essentially solely to rival Mario, right?
Yeah.
And as such, Sonic is basically the anti-Mario. The whole point is to be hip and trendy, which eventually, of course, always leads to being the exact opposite, not very hip and trendy. So Sonic has gone through hard times, to say the very least.
His games are... there has never been... I'm kidding. I'm not IGN.
Sonic... The first, decade...
Yeah.
The first decade of Sonic games was pretty good for the most part. Like, there were a few duds, like Sonic R, which the only contribution that game has made to society has been making several crappy creepypastas.
Sonic.exe?
No, Tails Doll. If you don't know about Tails Doll, bless your soul. Anyway, in the mid-2000s, Sonic had an identity crisis because being a 90s character in the mid-2000s just wasn't it. In the early 2010s, he finally started to rise back up and make some actually good video games like Sonic Generations, which pretty good game. Sonic Colors is also really good. And then since Sonic Generations, there's been one good Sonic game, and that was Sonic Mania, which was made by Sonic fans.
Debatable. What about the racing game? I don't know what it's called, but I enjoyed
Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing.
100%.
You're not... I don't think it's bad. It's not really a Sonic game.
Sonic games have become more and more safe. They're like any Vine star turned into YouTube hero, where they're just
what basically happened, right?
Fake
is
content. Yeah.
Sonic 06, right? That was the real.
That was a game.
Stinker.
That was
That was
If
a
it-
game. That was a real thing. Put the nail in the coffin of old 3D Sonic, and then after that came Sonic Unleashed, which created a new type of Sonic game using what's called the boost formula. So usually now there's a sort of formula for 3D Sonic games where you have sort of 3D sections, but not really 3D sections,
Right.
2D sections, and then some kind of gimmick thrown in there. And when you have like 5 games in a row that follow the same formula, eventually it's going to feel duller and duller. And they haven't really done a good job of straying away from that formula. They've also been riding on the coattails of Generation success by throwing classic Sonic into everything,
Yeah.
which isn't really
Sonic
what you should be
Forces.
doing.
Sonic Forces did
is a
give us the
video game.
choice of making our own Sonic character, which is what something fun game for anyone to play. Take your name, put it in a Google search bar, and then write the Hedgehog afterwards, and you will have a blast of a time.
What? What do you mean? Like,
Have you never done this?
Sonic OCs, man.
Oh my god, the Sonic fan base is more insane than the Bionicle fan base I was a part of. In that they would design their own hedgehogs or similar anthropomorphic animals and call themselves, like, for example, I can Google Christos the Hedgehog and find OC Sonic characters. Have you never done? Oh my god, right now, Dominic, just do it. Google search Dominik the Hedgehog.
alright.
I recommend anyone watching the podcast still, I don't know why you'd ever do that to yourself, but like,
Yeah, me neither.
Google it.
Oh my god! This is a thing.
Yes.
This
It's
is.
yeah.
Oh my god! And the
Oh
best part is, if
my
you scroll a little
God.
bit more, you're gonna find some hentai too.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh, stinky.
Head out.
Stinky.
Let's see Christos.
But yeah,
yeah.
one of the main things about Sonic 2 is that it's like such a dumb concept, and some Sonic games try to take it seriously, and some don't. And usually, the ones that do, you get Shadow the Hedgehog. And the less said about that game, the better.
So, for those of you who don't know, Shadow is maybe a clone of Sonic, or Sonic is a clone of him, whatever, no one cares, who's super dark and edgy. If you ever had a kid at your school that would sit at their own table and someone tried sitting with them and they'd say, "You can't handle the darkness within my soul, I don't have demons anymore, for I am my demon," and then, yeah, that's Shadow the Hedgehog.
Are you
In
talking
his
from
ga-
experience, Christos?
In his game, changing the subject, Sonic cursed. You know, in Shadow cursed, you got to see Sonic say the F word as he died, because Shadow had a gun and a motorcycle. And it's not like a cartoon gun, they straight up gave him, like, actual weaponry.
And AR. Jesus Christ.
But I think you bring up a really good point. When Sonic is good, it's when Sonic is fun. And like the first games, in Generations, and especially in this movie, when you take Sonic as a character and just put him in a completely disconnected environment and just let him run around and let the audience and Sonic have fun, that's when Sonic is best.
And I think what's really, like, best, let's be honest, this movie, shaky history. Let's just say that, right? The initial design of Sonic was just, plain old bad. It was. I don't want to swear because I'd have
He
to
had
censor it out.
Fingers and no gloves!
And he had the what was it? It was just, it like,
Eyes, like here, like an actual
Yeah.
hedgehog. They basically took the head of a hedgehog and put it on a human body and said, "Run, Abomination, run."
yeah, but it wasn't good. And they listened. They made this wonderful little fellow. It wasn't the spawn of Satan that was originally, this is a great movie about, this is a great movie that demonstrates, producers and directors listening to their audience, doing what
Yeah.
their audience really wants. And that's beautiful.
Violet
What
brought
other
up that the
movies
best
do we-
Sonic game of this decade was Sonic Mania. A game made by Sonic fans for Sonic fans. So a lot of the good parts about the Sonic movie really came from them looking towards fans and saying, "Hey, we know you know more about Sonic than we do. We know we're a soulless corporation, so like we're gonna take the guy who designed Sonic Mania and bring him on as a character designer and let him redesign Sonic." Also,
Wait, did that happen?
yeah, that happened.
That's crazy. That's amazing.
Yeah. And here's another thing, though, right? Like, if I want to go back to the corporate thing, whether we want to admit it or not, 90% of Sonic's redesign came from wanting to compete with the Detective Pikachu movie by having Sonic actually be cute.
It wasn't cute.
Sonic's
It was
adorable now. No, I'm saying now, like, the redesign was because they
Oh
wanted
yeah. Now it is.
I
But the
cannot
first-
watch this movie without wanting to pick Sonic up and give him a hug, because he's adorable.
100%. And when he was like, a little quirky boy, it was amazing.
Quirky boy.
Can I just say that this movie came out literally on the perfect day? Like, dude, it came out on Valentine's Day. That's beautiful. Yeah, I went to see, I went to see this movie with the boys on Valentine's Day. Like, what are you doing, dude?
I mean, gotta kiss your homies in the Sonic the Hedgehog movies on Valentine's Day. No homo.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're not talking about that though. I mean, no, it was a great time, and it was an absolutely beautiful movie. Jim Carrey, oh my god! I just say that.
Something I'd also like to bring up is the second character. I can't remember his name, but basically Sonic is being ferried across the U.S. by this guy. I mean, he gets character development, whatever. There's a plot to it. The movie doesn't have a bad plot by any means. It's a genuinely good movie. Definitely one of, if not the best, mainstream blockbuster video game movie adaptations. By that I mean games specifically in theaters for a wider U.S. audience, I should say, for as American-centric as that sounds. He has played the same character in so many different movies of escorting a CGI furry across the country. He did it in this movie, he did it in the Hop movie with, like, the Easter Bunny, and apparently he did it on some other direct-to-TV movies.
That's the guy!
It's the same guy! It's like, dude, you're getting typecasted as this.
When you get typecast as the guy that transports furs.
Yeah.
Living the dream.
Living the dream.
Living the dream.
You know, when you learn to love again from an anthropomorphic blue hedgehog that makes one-liners from the 90s, that's when you know you've peaked in your acting career.
For realsies.
America's favorite typecasted actor.
America's favorite typecasted actor! Do you want an actor to escort your blue, cute, furry animal across the United States to teach you how to love again? Well, do I have the actor for you?
Do you have a furry animal needed to be transported? Thousands of
Do
furry
you
animals.
have a car and a secret agent scientist that's insane chasing you down? Well, do I have the actor for you?
Wonderful. Absolutely immaculate.
Anything else to add to the movie? Alrighty then. This movie can be bought on a variety of different streaming sources for $20, although I think the price has gone down and it's just a regular Amazon Prime movie now. Yeah, so that wraps up our discussion of Sonic Ye Olde Hedgehog. Everyone, welcome back. It is now time for everyone's favorite, oh so secret and coveted, big-brained philosophical discussion prompt section. Dominic, please introduce the prompt.
So, the prompt for today is, do you believe that
So
Mario...
the prompt for today is... I never told him the prompt, I just wanted to embarrass him on camera.
What a great friend.
No, sometimes, I just...
The prompt for today is going to talk about, as most of our prompts do, change over time. As time moves forward, as time tends to do, in the grander scheme of things, as time does. Today's prompt is, comment on how would you guys say the quality of movies based on video games have changed over time, and with a sense of audience. So, by this I mean, when you look at video game movies, for the longest time, people have said there has never been a good video game movie. And really, we need to redefine this as mainstream blockbuster, gonna go see it in a cinema regularly like any other movie type film, because there have been, as Violet mentioned, very good video game movies that just aren't in American theaters. So how have video game movies changed over time? The way that I sort of see it is, you look at the past, like I just said, like the 1993 Mario movie, absolute garbage. But then you look at 2018, 19, and 2020, you got Detective Pikachu, pretty good film, but absolutely amazing visuals, and the Sonic the Hedgehog movie, which is not as visually stunning or cinematographically beautiful as Detective Pikachu, but a very visibly pleasing movie, to say the least, and a genuinely good movie.
I think the issue... Well, people say that there haven't been...
Did you seriously...
any...
I saw that. I saw you. I saw that. You went... people have been...
the turtleneck, it just adds up. I have to. Anyways, why I think there are people say that phrase, there hasn't been any good video game movies, is because, let's be honest, the video game, culture and the video game, the gamers, they're one of the most idolizing communities out there. If they like a video game, it's God. It's beyond,
I'm sorry, are you trying to say that video game movies are bad just because the audience disagrees with it?
No. I'm just saying the audience holds...
There's a disconnect between the audience and the people who make it.
There's a disconnect, right?
Okay.
The audience holds source material to a level of worship, and nothing that could be created would match that level, I think. Yeah. At least with, conventional American-centric views about video games and movies. Certainly not the case for Japan. I mean, look, there's been a lot of great movies about video games made in Japan.
Right. I mean, the
Not
Persona series is just emblematic of this.
Yeah, exactly. It's video gaming culture in America has become a very polarized one.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think a perfect example of this is the Warcraft movie and the Witcher series. Because when you look at the Warcraft movie, I mean, it's not bad. I personally enjoyed it, being a big World of Warcraft fan, because I'm a lame-o who has no friends and or life and or purpose in said life. But ultimately, there's a big disconnect between the people who made the movie, Blizzard as a corporation, and then the player base. So the people who made the movie, I want to say 99% of the cast never even played the games or even heard of them before making the movie. And this kind of was reflected in a lot of the cast's performances. Not in terms of the ogres, but when you look at the humans in that movies, their performances are a lot more bland. They're just doing any sort of typical fantasy-type genre movie that they could think of, and it really devalues the majority of this movie. But then you look at The Witcher 3, where the main actor, Henry Cavill, is such a big gamer. You guys know this, right? Henry Cavill's an absolute Chad Adonis gamer. He actually missed his phone call to say, hey, you're Superman, because he was raiding on World of Warcraft.
That's amazing.
So you can feel the level of passion and understanding and want he had in playing Geralt of Rivia, because he was an absolute fan of the game.
I also think Witcher is originally based on a book.
It is, but the show was mostly based on the show. I'm going to say it right here, and I mean, any Witcher fan will pretty much agree with me in saying that the books were not very good, but the video games are.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, Witcher is just a European classic, best thing to come out of Poland, Don't do it.
Our video game consultant. You above anyone else here is going to understand this divide between audience and Solus Corporation making it. How would you describe this dynamic?
I'm wondering if one thing might actually simply be sort of the ages, in a sense, right? So, think about other sort of, when you take a big book and make it into a big movie, right? So, Harry Potter, for example.
Right.
People that would be making Harry Potter, they probably read books as a kid. People who would have made a lot of, 90s video game movies, like the Super Mario movie, probably didn't grow up playing video games. They
For
probably
video
grew
games
up
just did not exist.
right. They just said it didn't exist, so they probably didn't play a whole lot of video games. And as such, I highly doubt, as you said, they don't really have a connection to the source material.
Right.
And it doesn't really help that video games as a medium, especially back then, right? Most of the story was kind of poorly translated cutscenes and almost even worse translated instruction manuals, right? That's where all the story was back then, unless you were like Final Fantasy or something like that. And even now, like a lot of larger games are very simple and still don't have super in-depth stories. So like, right, most Sonic games don't have very complicated stories. Just collect the Chaos Emeralds, defeat Eggman, something, victory. I don't know. And then, right, so in the Sonic movie, they take a whole different spin on it and actually are willing to sort of build up a new conflict from the ground up. And they treat it as like, that's the thing is, like, even some of the older movies would do that as well. And I'm wondering if it's really just the connection to the source material that's changed between then and now.
That makes so much sense. Which, honestly, accurately describes why we're seeing a higher influx in quality video game adaptations. Right? Like, I mean, every video game adaptation that's coming out right now, Witcher, Sonic the Hedgehog, Detective Pikachu, have been genuinely good and or amazing adaptations. And you're right in saying that people in the 2000s and the 90s, and especially the 80s, just never grew up and had a connection to the video games. For those corporations back then, especially, it was, okay, this is obviously profitable, so let's profit. But not understanding what it is that they're conveying, they just are unable to. Huh, I never thought about it like that. I thought it was just like adult bigotry. You know? Not bigotry. I mean, when the glass ceiling is broken, that lets the most oppressed group of all arise, gamers. But
Of course.
I always thought of it as like, that's a really interesting perspective.
I think the point that you bring up with age, like people growing up, you know, the more people, you know, like making making movies about video games previously, people directing them and all of that, they weren't like, you know, avid players of video games themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They were just people, like Christos said, seeking profit of a very profitable market at the time.
Yeah.
And as people, you know, as time goes on, as time does...
As time tends to do as it moves forward in the context of time.
That people grow up, and more people that play these video games are joining the movie industry, too.
Yeah. I mean, when you look at... Yeah, sorry, continue.
It collides directly, you know, like you have... It's the same kind of concept, you know, creating media for fantasy's sake, you know, creating something that's not necessarily real. Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, it's great. It's making more authentic movies. Like you had the Sonic movie listening to its fan base, and, you know, Witcher being so true to the video game.
Violet brought this up earlier, where it's like a lot of it had to do with growing up. I was listening to some interviews with Guillermo del Toro, and this happens really with every director, is that they really make movies based on what they enjoyed as a kid. So Pacific Rim, in particular, it was based off Guillermo del Toro's interest of big robots as a kid.
Gundam.
Mobile suit, walking, clothes.
Hey, I'll have to censor that too.
Yeah. So
yeah.
Huh.
I think we're just growing up. We're old now. That's the whole issue.
Oh.
No, not issue. It's the whole why movies are changing, or why video game movies are changing.
But
it's because
honestly, it's for the better.
Yeah, 100%.
100%. 100% progress in society.
100 points per Slytherin, you know? Well, anyways, thanks, Eric.
Well, you know what? That pretty much wraps things up in a neatly tight bow. Violet, thank you so much. Good luck with your next big game release next year. Cyberpunk 2077. That, you know, being the director of that game, I'm sure has been just an absolute blast.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Can you give us any, like... You can...
NDA.
You can't give us any,
Nope.
Nope.
Sorry.
God damn it.
those pesky non-disclosure agreements.
Right.
Jeez.
Oh, jeez, oh man.
Oh man. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the Socially Distant Untitled Podcast. I'm Christos.
I'm Dominik. Violet.
No. Looking
Okay.
at you.
Next week's prompt is... Get ready, this one's a really good one.